All right. Today we have David from Ritza to talk about how to set up a production web stack on Replit with Nginx. So thank you for being here, David.
Thanks, YK. Hi, everyone. I am a hacker, technical writer, and programmer, and I am here to speak to you all about using Nginx to do things with Replit that you probably didn't think were possible before.
Right. And what was the original motivation for writing this article?
Okay, so a few months ago, Replit, as I understand, started sort of moving over REPLs to a Nginx base from, I think, was Polyglot or something like that being used before. And Nginx is kind of well, it's a lot of things, but the main thing it is a functional package manager. So it's a way that you can kind of write a system configuration file in code and have that configuration, you can sort of reapply that configuration instantly. So if you think about like your home PC or MacBook or something, like when you first install Windows or like take it out of the box, then you have to go and like install your favorite programs and like download them from different places, and you have to like configure all the like different programs to have like whatever font size you want, turn on dark mode, that sort of thing. And so the idea of Nginx is to kind of do all of that in a completely programmatic way, like have a script that does all of that, and you know that if you take that script and run it on any PC anywhere, it'll produce the same output, and you'll get an environment that is, you can know that you'll get the same environment every time you run that script. And we can do that on a home PC, we can do that on a server, and we can also do that in a REPL. So the cool thing about the Nginx REPL type is that it kind of, I suppose you could think of it as kind of a build your own REPL in a sense. Like if you look at any of the like standard REPL types, your Python, Ruby, JavaScript, Kaboom, all these different types with like different languages, what is happening on the back end for the ones that are on Nginx, which will eventually be all of them, is that Nginx is being used to install like Python or Ruby or whichever programs are needed. So in the Nginx REPL type, you kind of have a blank slate to install your own programs. So you can use it. One obvious thing to use it for is if there's a language that you like that isn't supported on Replit, then you can install that language and then program with that language. But because Nginx is a general package manager like you would get on any other PC, you can basically install anything. So you can use it like you would use a server. So the main sort of goal I wanted to achieve with this tutorial is a lot of us like getting started with programming, learning that, getting to a more intermediate level, and using Replit to build more and more complicated projects, learning more and more about programming, and building more ambitious and complicated programs. At some stage, like you get pretty good at dev, but there's this whole other world called ops. And so if you've heard the phrase DevOps before, then that would be the second part. So dev, you write some code, you have code in a Python file, and then you sort of press run, and then it executes somehow. And ops is all about the details of like, how does it execute, Obviously, if we're just running like one Python script, then it's just a case of running that Python script. But when things get more complicated, when we want to say, here's a web server, here's a database, here is a task queue, here is a caching system, and whatever else we want to do. And so we want to like install all these programs, configure them, and have them talk to each other. And that's where ops comes in. And by using a Nginx REPL, you can, in the comfort of the same environment that you've been using to learn to program, start learning about ops and actually configure the sorts of things that run in the real world on real web servers. So yeah, that was the main sort of goal of this tutorial.
Right. Can you walk me through the particular stack that you set up in this template?
Sure. So the stack we're using is we have Nginx as the web server, and then we have a Python file as the actual web application, and then we have Postgress as the database.
And how did you choose this particular stack?
So mostly it was personal preference. Postgres is the most fully featured and most reliable database, in my opinion, and Nginx is the web server I use for pretty much all my projects whenever I need to. Other alternatives you could use are Apache instead of Nginx, or you could use MySQL or SQLite instead of Postgres. Or if you don't want to use a SQL database, you could use something like MongoDB. We actually have another tutorial coming out quite soon that involves setting up MongoDB and Redis, as well as a few other things in a similar way to what we do here. Okay. So the best place to start with this REPL is to show config files. So like I said before, the Nginx REPL is kind of a meta REPL, like a do-it-yourself REPL. And so in most REPLs, you won't, like these config files that start replit and replit.nginx be hidden, and you won't do anything with them. But with this one, we specifically want to start installing things. So always the first step with a Nginx REPL is to show config files in the little drop-down menu over there. So the main important file for a Nginx REPL is this replit.nginx, which is the file where you install everything. Looks a little bit funky. The Nginx language does take a bit of getting used to. So it's a functional language, which is similar to Haskell or F#, if you've ever used those. And what that means is that the language is entirely composed of functions that take inputs and produce outputs. And there's a certain amount of determinism about that. Like you can't have, in a functional language, you can't have, or in a pure functional language, if we want to be very specific, you can't have mutable state. So you can't have like a variable at the top that you set and then refer to within a function, because if you have a variable, say a global variable, that can essentially be anything. And if you're depending on the value of that global variable within your function, then that's going to change the outcome of the function. And as a pure functional language, we can't have anything that changes the outcome of a function. So that's the basic idea behind that. And so this code, we're going to just start by looking at these two parts of it, just ignoring the middle bit for now. But in most Nginx REPLs, what you'll see is it'll look basically like this. Is just going to be this block here, which defines an anonymous function. Anonymous function takes pkgs, which is the Nginx package library. And then you have, let me remove this too. Okay, and then you have the body of the function, which you just define this depths list. And that's just saying with the, so when this function executes, which it happens on the back end in the REPL itself, it'll pass in the next packages library and then install anything it can find inside depths from packages. The way to sort of find the things that you'll install is you go to search.nginx.org/packages, and then you can search for different things. So if we search for Python, you see there's a bunch of different versions of Python. If we search for Nginx, we have that as well. If we search for Palsay, that's also there. So basically, the first step is you kind of just search whatever you want to install here, and then you show more package details, and then you click on non-NixOS, and then you just copy packages.name, and you'll put that inside your replit.nix file. Okay, so bring back all the code I just deleted. We've obviously had to install Python. We also have to install the different libraries that we use in Python. So this is actually another key difference between, say, a Nix REPL and a Python REPL, is Replit does this really nice thing where whenever you type import package and you run, the next time you run your REPL, it'll automatically search pip and install that package. So you don't have to worry too much about when the package is installed. You can just import it. With the Nix REPL, because it's a generic REPL type, it doesn't know about pip, so we can't do that. So we have to find each of our packages like this. So that's the reason we do that. So Flask is a web framework that we've used for a lot of tutorials. Waitress is a production web server gateway interface. So if you've ever used Flask before, you'll know that you run applications by saying app.run, and then that sort of runs a server in the side there. And if you look closely at the output that server gives, it usually prints a couple lines at the top saying, this is like a development server, don't run it in production, which is for a few reasons. The main reason being it's slow. Other reason being that it is not terribly secure. It, especially if you enable the debug flag, it shows a lot of verbose error messages. And yeah, so basically, whenever you're running something in production, you want to use a production web server gateway interface instead, such as Waitress, which we've imported here. And then we import Postgress there, and then we import the Python library for Postgres, which is called psycopg2. Okay, so what you'll notice here is that we haven't imported packages.nginx, and this is for a specific reason. So if we take a look at the shell in Replit, basically every REPL is a Docker container. If you think of a Linux server somewhere in the cloud, it's kind of the server, and then on that server is a Docker container. You can think of a Docker container as a kind of jail that gives you like a separate file system so that you can sort of run as many Docker containers on an individual server as you want to not have them interfere with each other. But for most purposes, Docker containers are pretty much equivalent to virtual servers. So you can kind of think of your REPL as a virtual server that you can actually do anything in. So if we take a look at WD present working directory, we'll see that the current directory we're in is home/runner/Nginx template. If we do list files on that, we can see all the files over there. So this file pane actually exists at this location in the Docker container. And the user that we're running under when we do anything in our repo is this user called runner. And the key thing about runner is this user is not a privileged user. So it doesn't have full privileges. If we try to do something like apt install, for example, we can't do that because we're not root. So that's another thing that Nginx kind of allows us to do because of the way it installs packages in non-privileged locations. We can install packages here that we couldn't do with a traditional package manager in the traditional configuration. Right, so that one of the things about that is a bit of a gotcha is when we install packages, we're installing them in the Nginx store. This ls may not finish, it doesn't always, but don't matter. So when we install Python 3, PostgreSQL, Nginx, it all goes inside this Nginx store directory, which is different from the traditional way that you install things with apt or homebrew on Mac. Those programs will generally install things sort of all over your system. Like Nginx has components in /etc, it has components in /var, it has components in /bin, and it kind of expects certain files to be in certain locations. So if we just install Nginx modified directly as a package, and what happens is there are a bunch of files that it can't access because it expects to be running as root and it expects to be installed in a certain location that it isn't installed in Nginx. So luckily, Nginx is pretty much designed for exactly this kind of thing. So the real power of Nginx comes in, I mean, the reason we have a full programming language rather than just like a list of packages like you would get in, say, requirements.txt for a Python program, is so that we can actually modify the way packages are installed. So that's what we're doing here. We're taking the default Nginx package, we're calling override attrs to change things about it. If we take a look in Nginx GitHub Nginx, okay, so if we take a look at Nginx packages on GitHub, which, yeah, that's another cool thing about Nginx, is that this whole package repo that we're getting stuff from is on GitHub as this giant repo. And you can sort of look through in the packages. If you find something that's missing, you can actually write your own derivation for it. Derivation being the name of packages in Nginx, and submit a pull request, as people do all the time. So this is the one for Nginx. And if we take a look, it sets a whole lot of config variables. It creates a default Nginx configuration file and does various other things. There is quite a lot here, but this is the default installation of Nginx rather, which will look for certain files in certain locations that it won't be able to find them on our REPL. So what we do for the tutorial is we take a look at configure flags in here. Yeah, this is the problem with just Googling these things. I did find this before. I think it's probably even linked in the tutorial. Yeah, I think I did link it. Okay, yeah, it's this one. Okay, let me just restart that.
So you were looking at default.nix, but now you're looking at generic.nix?
Yeah. Okay, so when Nginx installs anything, it will get a package from essentially this repo rather, and it does a bunch of caching. Like there's binaries that are cached, so it won't build everything from source every time. But if we override attributes here, then it will do that. So in principle, you can think about when you add pkgs.python 3.9, you can think about it going to this repository, downloading a file like this, and then executing that file in Nginx, even if that's not technically how it always works. So that is obviously what it'll do for Nginx as well. So configure flags. We have a whole lot of flags that it runs. So yeah, over here we create the derivation for Nginx. We set some metadata. We set some of the dependencies it needs. And then we set these configure flags. And these configure flags are basically used to configure it for compilation. So we set all these flags before we compile to change the way that Nginx behaves in certain key ways. And the only reason we really want to do that is so that we can change these different paths and put them in the home directory. So the way that you'll figure this out, if you're doing this for something other than Nginx, is you'll start by installing pkgs.whatever the package is. You'll run your repo, and then you'll get some Nginx error messages. And then you'll do a lot of Googling and eventually figure out how to change the derivation in a way that gets it working, which in my experience usually involves doing stuff like this with file paths, where you'll move a path to the home directory, and then often you also have to just create the folder. So here I've created the cache folder, I've created it's for Postgres, and I've created the logs folder specifically for this. Usually you don't have to do anything more than like create a top level folder. Whatever program you're installing will just put the things it needs to put in that folder. Okay, so basically what happens with Nginx modified is Nix will, when we run a REPL, it will download this, and then it will change configure flags, this list here. It will add these configure flags that we've specified here. And in so doing, make Nginx actually work on our REPL.
So
yes.
I'm kind of curious. This seems like a lot of work to set up Nginx. So I'm kind of curious, like, when do you think it becomes necessary? Like, people start like a Flask app and they add Waitress, Postgres, and when do they need to add Nginx on top of that?
Okay, so the main benefit that Nginx gives you is that you can run different things. We didn't quite get the time for that in this tutorial, but if we take a look at the Nginx configuration file, so here is where we've got our HTTP block and then our server block. And so this configures, at the moment, it configures a proxy pass for our Flask app. But fundamentally, I can have as many of these location blocks as I want. So if I had a node app over here, I could set it up to listen on a different port. I could also serve files in a different place. So basically, it becomes useful when you want to serve a bunch of different things. Say if you have like your main app, and then maybe you have a blog that you've set up with WordPress or Ghost or something like that, and you want to serve it at /blog.
So you're saying you could have like multiple services within the single REPL?
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Do you think, like, when do you think that's the right approach as opposed to like having multiple REPLs for multiple services?
So it would depend on how coupled you want the services to be. You would also maybe you have like some of the services could be more sensitive than others.
Yeah,
or
I guess.
they could, yeah, I suppose it's mostly if they are sort of very tightly coupled. If you want to have, /blog, have a blog there, and then on the main site something else. If you want to be able to use the same domain, basically, is when you would want to do that.
I see. Or would it be possible to like have, say, the Python server and the Node server share the same database?
Yes, yeah, that would be another good one. So yeah, if you had just one database, then you could have two apps that share the same database.
Cool.
Or two apps that communicate with each other in some interesting way.
Right. So I think we went over how you set up Nginx. Did you want to walk through how you set up Postgres?
Yeah, sure. So that is a bit simpler. So setting up Postgres, we just install it straight from Nginx. And then okay, so the other thing with Nginx repls is there's kind of a distinction between like installing packages and actually running the REPL, which is where this other file comes in. So here it's just about installing the packages that we're going to use. And then when we press run, we want to actually start all of those different things. So the first step for that is we go into .replit and we change the run command to a command that we want to run. By default, it's going to be calsay welcome to Nginx on Replit, which will just print a string in the terminal. What I always like to do is create a shell script called start.sh and just run that shell script. Because usually when you're running a lot of different services, the script gets to be quite big and you don't really want to fit it into this little string here. So then we take a look at our start script. So here in the start script, we're starting Postgres and Nginx and our Flask app. At the moment, Replit doesn't have like a stop script that you can run. So something we have to do to kind of work around that is every time we do the run script, we kind of have to make sure that the previous run has stopped. So And we have to do that before we try to start anything. So for that reason, when setting up PostgreSQL, the first control is to stop any previous instance of Postgres that's running. And the great thing about this command is if no version of Postgres is currently running, then nothing will happen. So yeah, we can run it irrespective. So we will first stop any existing Postgres, and then we'll use another command that will fail if, so all these commands that we use here, up to here, are about initializing a database. And with initdb and with createdb and with all these commands, what's great about them is they'll fail if we already have an existing database. So we can run this code every time we run the REPL and it won't overwrite our database. So yeah, we start by stopping any existing Postgres database. Then we initialize a database, which will only do something on the first run. We then copy our template configuration file, which is a long file of mostly commented out lines. The one important line is this one with replace Unix dir. Yeah, so this just configures the Unix socket directory. And this is actually kind of what we're doing with the socket directory is actually very similar to what we did with Nginx. But whereas Nginx, the file locations that it uses for certain things are hard-coded like into the binary, and we have to change them before we compile it. With PostgreSQL, it's all in this config file, so we don't have to mess around with Nix. We can just give it a config file. So what we do here is we set the socket directory to this directory here in Postgres. So it's local, so it won't try to find it somewhere else in our Docker container where we don't have access to as the running user. And then we replace that. So in the template file for the config, we have this replace Unix directory, and that's going to be replaced by /home/runner/repl/slug/postgres, with repl/slug being a useful way to get the name of your repl from the environment that you can use in bash scripts. Okay, so then once that, so yeah, that will basically create this file in data, postgresql.conf. So if we look there, we see home runner Nginx Postgres. Same as the template with that put in, yeah.
What's that SED there?
Okay, so yeah, sed is a shell program for replacing lines in files. So essentially you specify -I, geez, I always forget what the flags are. Like, I think it's case insensitive. Yeah, so then you do S for substitutes, and you specify what you're going to replace, and then you specify what you're going to replace it with, and then you specify the file that you're going to replace the string in. This is quite a simple replacement. We can also use regex if we needed to.
Where did the original version of that configuration file come from?
So that we found online. You just Google Postgres default configuration file. Okay, so then we actually start up. So yeah, this is all setting up the database, and then over here we actually start it. We give it a local log file, and then at that point we have Postgres running. So then once we have Postgres running, we need to create a database on the, so we connect to Postgres on the local loopback address, and then create a database called FDB, and that's what we'll use from our Flask app. And then once Postgres is set up, we kill any existing Nginx's. We run a new Nginx using a local error log and our configuration file. And then we start our Flask application. Okay, and then what this looks like in practice. Please tell me I haven't broken something. Oh my. Did I change? I mean, I know I deleted some things and then undid that, but I don't think I changed anything. Oh, there we go. There we go. You just have to give it a bit of time. Okay, so then we have our Flask app running. And as this tutorial was mostly focused on the ops side, we haven't written anything too fancy for this. It's just hello from Python. And then we use the Python Postgres library to connect and select the version information of our Postgres database. And so, yeah, from here you could write anything using the Postgres database.
Cool. Why are you using port 8181 there?
Okay, so if we take a look at Replit's docs, there's a very useful one for this specific sort of thing where we see deploy HTTP servers. And here it specifies that I swear it used to say that you had to run it on port 8000. Okay, yeah. So here we're running a database on port 8080. Here we're running a web server on port 8080. And okay, so I think actually I've just realized, I think, and this would make sense with stuff I've done with Replit before, is you can actually run a web server on any port, right? I always thought you had to use specifically 8080, but
yeah, I always used 8080. So
yeah, I mean 8080 is kind of the like default go-to, but I think you can do it on any port. Okay, so anyway, rewinding, redoing that. Okay, so port 8081, basically we're using it because we've already got Nginx listening on port 8080. And so we can really use any of the over 65,000 ports. But I just chose 8081 just to not listen on 8080. And then if, say, you were to run a node server or something else, you could listen on 8082 or something else. Just the key thing is not two things listening on the same port, because they won't be able to run in parallel.
So from outside REPL, it goes to 8080, and then Nginx sends that to 8181.
Yes, exactly.
Can you go back to the Python file?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of read through this code.
Yeah, pretty much it's just serve on the home routes, connect to Postgres, run select version, and return the output.
Right, and then at the end, instead of doing up.run, you're doing serve.
Okay. Yeah, so here we've replaced this app.run is our development server, and we've replaced it with serve, which we imported from Waitress.
Nice. So I guess I'm trying to understand like how you went about like creating this whole thing. So first you created a Nginx REPL, right?
Yes.
And then what was like the next thing you did?
Okay, so from there, I decided that I wanted to install Nginx and Postgres and Python. And so I took a look in here, and I took a look here, and I kind of searched all the different packages I'd need.
Right. And then like
put them in there.
you added those to the replit.nginx file, and then you created those folders kind of manually.
Yeah.
And you created main.py.
I suppose basically it goes, I started by putting all the packages here. I ran the REPL. I saw the error messages. I fixed Nginx. I kept running the REPL until I got no more error messages. Once that was done, I knew everything was installed fine, and it was time to actually run it. And so I went in here. I changed it to start.sh. And then I created the script. And then I got config files for Nginx and Postgres, and kind of just did a bit of trial and error with this to see what config files and what different options were needed to get things to run. What was very useful for me to be able to do was ps alt in REPL shell, which will tell you everything that's running. So here we can see Nginx, we can see Python main, and we can see Postgres, and we can see the start.sh file as well. So we know that's all running. And sometimes if something had failed silently, say Postgres didn't come up, then it wouldn't be here, and I know something was wrong there. So that was also a useful part of the debugging.
Right. And what about the file mime.pytypes?
Okay, so that is another file that Nginx uses. It's included there. So that is sort of just the different file extensions that Nginx recognizes. So whenever a web server serves a file, it'll serve it with a MIME type, and there's basically a dictionary of those. So Nginx knows if it serves a JPEG to serve it with /image JPEG, JavaScript, etc., and so on. Mostly in practice, that means that your browser will know to say download a zip file rather than try to actually display it, or display an image file rather than try to download it.
Was that file created by Nginx?
So yeah, this is a default Nginx file that I found online.
Oh, you found it and then you put it there.
Yeah. So all of these programs, Nginx and PostgreSQL, and most things in the Linux world are open source. And a lot of them are actually hosted on GitHub. So you can just search it up, find it, and usually the repos for those projects will have files that you need. In the case of MIME types, it was a case of this is also a default Nginx configuration file. So yeah, either you can find the configuration files in like the repository for the project, or sometimes you can find it in the project's docs. I'll say here's a default configuration file which you can use. And then there was I had a bit of trial and error, just making sure that everything was everything that needed to be included in this config file was included, which included this MIME types file that I had to then copy from Nginx. Another place where it would be is within the Nginx store, that ls that didn't complete. So it's a bit difficult to show this part because basically it's like Nginx store and then there's a lot of long hashes and then you can see like /nginx or /postgres or stuff. And those directories also, like they all had the default config files that come with Postgres and Nginx.
I see. And if someone wanted to, fork your template, would they need to change anything?
Yes. Yeah. So the key things they would need to change would be they would need to put their the name of their fork if they wanted to change the name over here. They wouldn't need to do it for this file because that's handled in the start script. Yeah, I think that's actually it. So you just have to change that. But yeah, if you go through our tutorial on building
with Nginx on
Nginx on Replit, then it walks you through exactly all the things you have to do.
Right. So I feel like we've covered enough of this particular application, but on that post, you've covered like a few other applications, right?
Yeah.
Can you maybe show us those?
Sure. So another one so this really is kind of the big thing. Like it took a lot of work to set it up and configure it and get everything working. The rest of the stuff we look at is pretty simple. Like with a Nginx REPL, ideally, yeah, in ideal cases, you'll just need to add a few packages to replit.nginx, and it'll just work, which is largely the case for this. So Jupyter is kind of an online notebook for doing like interactive coding. And here we installed in a REPL by just installing packages.jupyter from Nginx packages. And then we run our normal start sh script. In the script, we create data directory, and then we run Jupyter notebook, listening on all interfaces, port 8080, and then specifying the notebook dir as data. So if we run that, we pop it out. Then here it is. We just have to get the token from here. We paste that. Log in, and then we can create a new notebook. And yeah, you can have code that you run. You can have different types of cells. So I think there it is. Yeah. So you can have a markdown cell where you have you can also, as we've shown in a screenshot, you can do things with graphics such as drawing graphs. You just import PyLab and NumPy, then you can draw graphs. So yeah, it's a nice way to do interactive coding. And then another thing that we've run is a VS Code server, which is kind of, if you've ever used the VS Code text editor on your local PC, this is kind of a web-based version. So in our REPL here, we have, here we install the code server and some dependencies that it requires. And there we run start.sh. And in start.sh, we run trace with our code server. And there we have it. Fully featured text editor in the cloud. And you can do any, more or less anything that you would do locally. You can open, yeah, we can open our, I think we should be able to open our files that we were just looking at. Although I don't see them.
So you're running a text editor in cloud from another text editor in cloud.
Yes. Yeah.
What's the third application that you put on your post?
Okay, so the third one is we can run Dosbox, which is an emulator for DOS programs. So essentially we can run any DOS program, but the one that everyone always wants to run on different systems is the classic Doom. I just need to quickly check commands for getting Doom to run within the repo, README. Okay, there we go. There we're here. Okay, so then we do mount C.
You needed to find like Doom somewhere, right? And then like download it and upload it.
Yeah. So that was a case of, yeah, just finding the Doom files, which are open source now. I believe that, okay, wait, I don't know why it says Dosbox. We should probably fix that. Let me just do that quickly. So it's, yeah, I mean, it should be that, right? So we mount this directory here as C, we switch to C, we cd into the Doom folder, and then we run Doom. What am I doing wrong here? Oh wait, I didn't cd into Dooms. Oh, I know. Okay, yeah. So we needed to, we mounted home runner, and we should have mounted home runner / DOSBox. Right. Okay, so we mount C. Okay, and then we switch to C. We cd into that one, and then we do and here we go. Doom in a REPL.
That's really cool.
Hey,
Is
yeah.
there, yeah, is there like any other application you want to try at some point?
Uh, okay, so the other one that I had open is we can run, I think, yeah, that's really it for the like cool flashy ones. We can also run COBOL in Nginx which runs this COBOL program. Unfortunately, I have no idea how COBOL works, so I couldn't tell you what it's actually doing. But yeah, if you are interested in learning COBOL, which apparently is a very in-demand skill, like you can get paid quite highly because most of the people who know it are dead or close to death.
Right.
So if you want to go work on a mainframe, then you can start by installing COBOL in a REPL and doing some work on it.
That one, it's not linked from the main article, right?
It is linked, yeah.
Oh, it is. Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. We kept referring to this article, but I think it's really good. Like it covers kind of the same thing, but like in a different way.
Yeah.
So viewers should, like, if you're watching this, you should probably check it out. Anyway, was there anything else you wanted to add to this conversation?
I think we've covered everything, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much again, David.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your day. Cheers.